Did you know that giving the wrong Christmas present in Victorian England could actually damage your social standing? Find out the surprising etiquette rules that governed gift-giving in the 19th century, and learn how presents were used to navigate social hierarchies and express affection. Forget wrapping paper and bows. Victorian Christmas gifts often arrived in bizarre and elaborate packages, and the contents could be even more unexpected. Join us as we unravel the surprising traditions behind Victorian gift-giving, from the extravagant to the downright strange. Imagine a world where the pressure to give the perfect Christmas present can actually make you sweat. That was the reality for Victorians, who faced strict etiquette rules surrounding gift-giving. In this video, we'll delve into the surprising expectations placed on both givers and receivers during the festive season. Grab a blanket. This Christmas tale might just chill you. Before you tear into wrapping paper and pass around mugs of cocoa, take a moment. Grab a blanket, settle in somewhere cozy, and let me take you back, not just a few decades, but a full century and more. Because in Victorian England, giving a Christmas gift wasn't just a kind gesture. It was a high-stakes social ritual, a moment that could elevate your standing or ruin your reputation entirely. Imagine sweating over the perfect present, not because you wanted to make someone smile, but because you were afraid of being seen as cheap, clueless, or worse, improper. Victorians didn't just exchange gifts. They used them to navigate power, express affection, seal flirtations, or assert class superiority. And behind every box tied with ribbon was a web of etiquette more tangled than a string of fairy lights. So wrap yourself up and listen close. You're about to discover a side of Christmas that is rarely told, a story full of silent messages, strict expectations, and the sometimes bizarre, sometimes beautiful world of Victorian gift-giving. Picture the scene. It is Christmas morning, in the year of our Lord, 1875. The air in the parlor is thick and sweet with the scent of fresh pine from the evergreen, garlands festooning the mantelpiece, and the beeswax of a dozen gently burning candles. A soft, rhythmic crackle emanates from the hearth. It's warm, golden light dancing across the polished mahogany of the furniture and glinting on the silver teapot. Outside, a gentle snow has begun to fall, muffling the world in a blanket of pristine white and adding to the sense of cozy, domestic sanctity. On a small, ornate side table, as if placed upon an altar, sits a single, exquisitely wrapped parcel. The paper is a deep, rich crimson, the ribbon a cascade of perfectly tied silk. A young woman, her face a portrait of demure anticipation, approaches it. Her family watches, their expressions a mixture of festive benevolence and quiet, intense scrutiny. With delicate fingers, she unwraps the gift, the crisp paper whispering as it yields. Her eyes, moments before alight with a gentle, hopeful glow, suddenly cloud over. Her smile falters, then vanishes completely. Her face falls, and in that instant, the warm, joyful atmosphere of the room evaporates, replaced by a sudden shocking chill. The gift, now revealed in its velvet-lined box, is a hairbrush set. It is an object of undeniable quality. The backs are solid silver, intricately chased with a pattern of ivy, and her initials are elegantly monogrammed in the center. But it is also an unmitigated disaster. A hairbrush is an article of the most private, intimate nature, an item belonging to the hidden world of the boudoir, of disrobing and personal grooming. To receive such a thing from a suitor, a man she has been acquainted with for a mere 6 months, is a shocking, almost scandalous breach of propriety. It is far too familiar, too presumptive, an unspoken claim on her private life that he has no right to make. The room, once filled with the gentle hum of Christmas cheer, is now plunged into a thick, profound silence. Her mother's lips, which had been curved in a placid, maternal smile, press themselves into a thin, hard line of stern disapproval. The damage is done. The suitor, in his well-meaning but catastrophic ignorance, has just committed an act of social suicide from which he may never recover. In the rigid labyrinthine world of Victorian England, a poorly chosen Christmas gift was not merely an awkward moment to be smoothed over with a polite, if strained, "Oh, you shouldn't have." It could be a full-blown social catastrophe. In a society governed by a suffocatingly complex code of unspoken rules, strict hierarchies, and relentless etiquette, the act of giving a present was never a simple, spontaneous exchange of goodwill. It was a high-stakes social performance, a public examination of one's taste, breeding, social standing, and, most importantly, moral character. To select the wrong gift was to fail this crucial test, and the consequences could ripple outwards, causing anything from a private, stinging embarrassment to a public, humiliating scandal that could cast a long, dark shadow over relationships for years to come. Why was there such a tempest in a teacup, such profound drama over a simple gift? Because in the 19th century, a gift was never simple. It was a message, a symbol, a meticulously calibrated signal within a complex social ecosystem where direct communication was often frowned upon. Every single detail mattered. Every nuance was scrutinized. The monetary value of the present had to be calculated with the precision of an apothecary measuring a volatile substance. It had to perfectly reflect the specific degree of intimacy in the relationship. A gift that was too inexpensive was a clear sign of disrespect or dismissiveness. One that was too expensive was an act of gross vulgarity, or worse, a crass attempt to place the recipient in your debt. Its function had to align perfectly with the strictly prescribed gender roles and social spheres of the time. And its presentation, the quality and color of the wrapping paper, the neatness of the handwritten label, the very manner in which it was delivered, was a public testament to your understanding of the subtle, essential arts of civilized life. A careless gift did not just suggest a momentary lapse in judgment. It suggested a careless, and therefore inferior person. The social minefield was vast, treacherous, and littered with hidden traps for the unwary. For a gentleman to present a single woman with an item of personal adornment, such as a piece of jewelry, a pair of gloves, or the aforementioned hairbrush set, was seen as dangerously forward. It was an improper implication of a romantic intimacy that had not yet been formally sanctioned by her family. A leap across social boundaries that was both presumptuous and alarming. Yet, the opposite error was just as perilous. To gift her something too plain, too impersonal, a simple handkerchief, a ream of writing paper, a book of sermons, risked being interpreted as a cold, deliberate snub, a clear signal of disinterest. It was a terrifying tightrope walk between the chasm of presumption on one side and the abyss of indifference on the other. Similarly, offering an overly extravagant gift to someone of a lower social station was a cardinal sin of etiquette. It was not perceived as generosity. It was perceived as a crude and distasteful flaunting of one's wealth, an act designed to highlight the social distance between giver and receiver. Such a gesture could inflict a mortal embarrassment upon the recipient, shaming them with an obligation they could never hope to repay, while simultaneously branding the giver as hopelessly nouveau-rich and lacking in true refinement. There were unspoken hierarchies at play. a silent, class-based ledger of acceptable offerings that everyone was expected to implicitly understand. The upper classes, cocooned in their world of inherited wealth and emotional restraint, often exchanged gifts that were luxurious but pointedly impersonal. Handsomely bound books were a popular choice, but the topics had to be carefully selected. History, botany, or travel were acceptable. Novels, with their messy explorations of human passion, were often not. Silver desk sets, imported delicacies like candied fruits or exotic teas, and framed engravings of classical ruins were also common. These were not objects intended to stir the heart or forge a deeper connection. They were props in the grand formal theater of aristocracy, elegant signals of wealth and refined taste that served to maintain, rather than bridge, emotional boundaries. In stark contrast, the burgeoning middle and lower classes, with less disposable income but a greater cultural emphasis on the language of sentiment, relied heavily on handmade gifts. An embroidered bookmark, a pressed flower album, a hand-painted card, a knitted scarf. These were tokens of time, effort, and genuine feeling. They were valued not for their monetary cost, but for the hours of labor and love they represented. In these circles, a gift was a piece of oneself, a tangible expression of affection in a way that a shop-bought item could never be. And the immense pressure was not confined to the giver alone. The receiver, too, had a crucial and difficult role to play in this delicate social drama. Their performance, in the moments after the gift was unwrapped, was just as rigorously scrutinized. Upon opening a present, one was expected to display a perfectly modulated expression of gratitude, a just right blend of grace, humility, and gentle, refined enthusiasm. To show too much delight could make one look greedy, grasping, or unsophisticated. To show too little was to be ungrateful, unfeeling, or, heaven forbid, unimpressed by the offering. A misstep on either side of this fraught exchange could fuel weeks of malicious gossip, earn you an icy silence at the next dinner party, or, in the most extreme cases, lead to a complete and bewildering social estrangement, a friendship mysteriously and irrevocably severed. So yes, for the Victorians, the festive cheer of the Christmas season was invariably laced with a potent, nerve-wracking dose of anxiety. It was a season of goodwill underwritten by the omnipresent terror of getting it wrong. Today, a bad gift might earn a private eye roll, a forced smile, and a swift, anonymous trip to the local charity shop. But back then, a gifting fiasco could be remembered for decades, etched into the acid of family lore, lamented in the private, ink-stained pages of a diary, or silently punished with the cold, unforgiving shoulder of a friendship that had been irrevocably bruised. Welcome to the world where Christmas cheer came with a side of high-pressure performance, a heavy burden of expectation, and a whole lot of quiet, cutting judgment. And this, believe it or not, was just the beginning of the story. If you believe that your current holiday-induced anxiety, a potent cocktail of financial dread, scheduling nightmares, and the existential fear of your uncle's political opinions, is the pinnacle of seasonal stress, allow me to introduce you to the Victorian Christmas. It was a Yuletide experience so fraught with peril, so laden with social booby traps, that it makes our modern squabbles over gift cards look like a pleasant stroll through a winter wonderland. For the Victorians, giving a Christmas present was not a spontaneous act of affection. It was a carefully choreographed ballet of etiquette, a high-stakes performance where a single misstep could lead to public humiliation, a ruined reputation, or a family feud that would simmer for generations. This wasn't just about being polite. It was about survival in a society more rigidly structured than a whalebone corset. Every gift was a message, a status symbol, and a test of character, all rolled into one. The unwritten rule book was thicker than a Dickens novel and twice as judgmental. And everyone, from the loftiest aristocrat in their drafty manner to the most ambitious clerk in his cramped city lodgings, was expected to have memorized every single soul-crushing word. To fail was not merely to give a bad gift. It was to reveal a fatal flaw in your breeding, your taste, and your very moral fiber. So, pour yourself a stiff brandy, steel your nerves, and let us venture into the terrifying, treacherous world of Victorian gift-giving. Rule 1. Know your place and theirs. Before a Victorian even considered what to give, they had to perform a complex social calculation based on the first and most important commandment of their society. Thou shalt not forget the great ladder of class. Victorian life was a rigid hierarchy, and Christmas gifting was one of the primary ways this hierarchy was maintained, polished, and brutally enforced. Giving a gift was less an exchange between individuals and more a transaction between tiers. Giving a present to someone of a higher station was an exercise in pure, uncut terror. The goal was to be respectful without being invisible, and appreciative without being presumptuous. It was a needle that was nearly impossible to thread. Consider the plight of a nervous young solicitor hoping to make a good impression on his senior partner, a man whose boots were worth more than the solicitor's entire wardrobe. What does he give? A handsome silver letter opener? The audacity. It screams, I, a lowly creature of the courts, presume to know your taste in desk accessories, and implies a familiarity that is simply not there. It's an act of social climbing so naked it's practically indecent. A fine bottle of port? Perhaps, but what if the partner is a connoisseur who only drinks vintages from a specific, unobtainable year? The gift then becomes an advertisement of one's own ignorance. The safest route was to offer something modest, handmade, and utterly impersonal, a small token from one's wife, like a hand-embroidered bookmark. It was a gift that bowed and scraped, acknowledging the chasm between giver and receiver. It said, I am but a humble worm, my lord, but please accept this worm-like offering as a symbol of my eternal deference. Gifting downwards, on the other hand, was a performance of power disguised as generosity. The lady of the house, descending on Christmas morning to bestow presents upon her staff, was not engaging in an act of friendship. She was performing her role as the benevolent matriarch, the gracious overlord of her domestic kingdom. The gifts were calibrated with chilling precision to be kind, but never, ever personal. A pretty ribbon for the parlor maid, a warm pair of socks for the coachman, a single, shiny orange for the boot boy. These were not gifts that said, I see you as a fellow human being. They were gifts that said, I am fulfilling my charitable duty, and this token will temporarily improve your station without giving you any dangerous ideas about equality. To give a servant a gift of real monetary value or personal significance would be to blur the lines, to suggest a friendship that could not exist. Equality in gifts implied equality in class, a notion so horrifying it could cause the entire social fabric to unravel. Even among the burgeoning middle classes, who were all desperately scrambling up the same slippery pole, gifting was a competitive sport. The exchange of presents between two families was a silent, brutal audit of each other's financial health and social standing. Every item was mentally appraised. Oh, the Jacksons gave us a set of porcelain fish forks. Very nice. I wonder if they know we got the Willards a silver-plated toast rack, which is clearly a tier above. A gift that was too cheap was an insult. One that was too expensive was a vulgar display, an attempt to shame the recipient. It was a Cold War fought with doilies and gravy boats, where the only victor was a lingering sense of mutual resentment. Rule 2. Don't be too personal unless you mean it. In a world where emotions were kept on a tighter leash than a prize poodle, a Christmas gift was a rare opportunity to send a message. But this made it a communication channel fraught with danger, because every object was imbued with a hidden meaning. A gift wasn't just a thing. It was a coded declaration, and woe betide the person who sent the wrong signal. The courtship gift was the ultimate minefield. A young man wishing to express his interest in a young lady had to navigate a path so narrow it made a tightrope look like a 6-lane highway. His gift had to be flirtatious enough to be noticed, but not so forward as to be scandalous. It was here that the infamous hairbrush incident occurred. To a modern mind, a hairbrush is a practical item. To the Victorian mind, it was an object of shocking intimacy. It belonged in the private space of a woman's boudoir, used in a state of undress. To give an unmarried woman a hairbrush was to leapfrog over the entire courtship process, the polite calls, the chaperoned walks, the exchange of pressed flowers, and land squarely in the territory of marital familiarity. It was the social equivalent of a man showing up for a first date and asking what you'd like to name your future children. It was not a gift. It was a scandal in a box. The spectrum of acceptable suitor gifts was laughably small. At the safe end lay the soul-crushingly boring, a book of bland sermons, a box of plain stationery, or a single, chaste white flower. These gifts safely communicated nothing at all, which often left the poor girl wondering if the suitor was interested, or simply fulfilling a social obligation with the least possible effort. At the other end of the spectrum lay the socially suicidal, a pair of gloves, a bottle of perfume, or, the nuclear option, a piece of jewelry. A locket or a ring was not a gift. It was a proposal. If her family did not approve of the match, this gesture would be seen as a hostile takeover bid for their daughter's affection, and the relationship would be terminated with extreme prejudice. Even outside of courtship, personal gifts were a minefield. To give a married woman a hand mirror could be interpreted as a sly and deeply insulting comment on her vanity. To give a man a pair of exquisitely embroidered slippers was to suggest a level of domestic intimacy that was wildly inappropriate unless you were his wife or his mother. Every gift spoke, and its message was dissected with the precision of a surgeon. The pressure was immense, turning the simple act of choosing a present into a nerve-shredding ordeal. Rule 3. Presentation was everything. If you think the Victorians were casual about what was inside the box, you can be certain they were downright fanatical about the box itself. The modern concept of flimsy, mass-produced wrapping paper would have horrified them. For a Victorian, the presentation of a gift was as important as the gift itself, another opportunity to display one's class, taste, and dedication to doing things properly. Gifts were rarely just handed over. They were presented. An object might be nestled in an ornate box lined with silk or velvet, tucked into a hand-embroidered pouch tied with satin ribbons, or even concealed within an elaborate puzzle box that required both wit and dexterity to open. This wasn't just for show. It was a reflection of the giver's care and status. A package might be adorned with lace, dried flowers, and a wax seal bearing the family crest, a subtle but unmistakable flecks of one's lineage. The package itself was a work of art, a testament to the idea that beauty and effort mattered. The act of delivery was also part of the performance. Gifts were often delivered by a servant, adding a layer of formality and distance to the exchange. Or they might be placed discreetly on a parlor table during a Christmas visit, to be discovered later. The crass, direct exchange of presents was often avoided. Instead, the process was imbued with a sense of ceremony and restraint. This carefully managed presentation ensured that even a modest gift could feel significant. It was a way of saying, the object itself may be small, but the respect and care with which I offer it are immense. It was a world away from tearing open a gift in a frenzy of paper and tape. It was a slow, deliberate ritual designed to be savored and, of course, judged. Rule 4. Always acknowledge with grace. The performance did not end once the gift was received. In many ways, that's when the most treacherous part began. The recipient's reaction was a critical part of the ritual, and it was scrutinized just as intensely as the gift itself. One had to walk the emotional tightrope between two cardinal sins, gushing greed and cold ingratitude. Upon receiving a gift, you were expected to produce a very specific, carefully calibrated display of pleasure. Too much enthusiasm gasps, squeals, or an overly avaricious gleam in the eye made you look desperate and materialistic. It suggested you were unaccustomed to receiving nice things. Too little enthusiasm, a polite, tight-lipped smile, or a quiet thank you was even worse. It marked you as ungrateful, arrogant, and poorly raised. Your muted reaction would be the subject of gossip for weeks. Did you see Eleanor's face when her aunt gave her that lovely needlepoint kit? She looked positively funereal. After all the trouble poor Mildred went to. The true test of character was receiving a gift you actively loathed. Imagine being a young woman with a passion for novels and receiving a heavy tome titled The Management of the Christian Household. Your internal monologue is a scream of despair, but your outward expression must be one of serene delight. Oh, Aunt Agatha, how wonderfully thoughtful. You must chirp, your soul dying a little inside. A guide to combating mildew. I shall treasure it always. And the performance wasn't over until the paperwork was filed. A handwritten thank you note was not optional. It was mandatory. It had to be dispatched promptly, written on good quality paper, and composed with care. It had to specifically mention the gift, say something positive about it, and express warm wishes to the giver. To fail to send a note was a social crime of the highest order. It was a clear signal that you were an ill-mannered savage, and your name would be struck from future gift lists and, quite possibly, polite society itself. So the next time you find yourself stressing over a last-minute gift, take a moment to be grateful. Be grateful that you can give your friend a bottle of wine without it being interpreted as a comment on their sobriety. That you can give your cousin a sweater without it being a statement on their social standing. And that the worst consequence you're likely to face is a slightly awkward hug. You are not a Victorian. Your social survival does not hang in the balance. The ghost of Christmas past may have left us with its lingering anxieties, but at least it spared us the tyranny of the silver hairbrush. To our modern sensibilities, a gift is a relatively straightforward affair. It's a token of affection, a gesture of appreciation, a festive obligation ticked off a list. We might worry if the recipient will like it, if it's the right size, or if they already have one. But it's doubtful that many of us lie awake at night, gripped by the cold fear that our choice of a scented candle might irrevocably damage our social standing and expose us as a moral degenerate. For the Victorians, however, that fear was not just plausible. It was practically a Christmas tradition. In 19th century England, a gift was never just a gift. It was a statement, a mirror, a meticulously crafted, ribbon-adorned social resume that revealed everything about your class, your values, your education, and your very soul. Victorian society, particularly the rapidly expanding middle class, was in the grip of a collective obsession with appearances and respectability. This wasn't just about having money. It was about having good taste, a far more slippery and treacherous commodity. Taste was the invisible ink that wrote your true character. It was the secret handshake that separated the refined from the vulgar, the genteel from the common. And at no time was this judgment more acute than at Christmas, when the exchange of gifts became a public audit of one's inner worth. What you gave, how you gave it, what it was made of, and the unspoken message it carried could elevate you to the pantheon of the respectable or cast you into the outer darkness of the socially inept. Every present was a performance, and everyone was a critic. For the vast majority of Victorians, the working-class families who fueled the engines of the empire, Christmas gifts were not about fashion or social climbing. They were about survival, sentiment, and the small, sacred joys that could be wrested from a life of relentless toil. Their gifts were often handmade, humble, and deeply practical, but to dismiss them as cheap would be to fundamentally misunderstand their language. In a world of scarcity, these objects were rich with a meaning that money could not buy. A child waking on Christmas morning might find their most prized possession to be a single glorious orange nestled in the toe of a stocking. To us, it's a piece of fruit. To them, it was an exotic treasure, a burst of sunshine from a faraway land, a luxury so profound it was tasted only once a year. Its vibrant color and intoxicating scent were a stark contrast to the gray, coal-dusted reality of their daily lives. That orange wasn't just a snack. It was a symbol of a world beyond their own, a fleeting moment of wonder. Similarly, a hand-knitted scarf or a pair of mittens was not merely a defense against the biting winter cold. It was a testament to a mother's love, woven into physical form. Every stitch represented an hour stolen from exhaustion, a moment of care in a day filled with grueling labor. The wool might be coarse, the color drab, but the warmth it provided was both literal and deeply emotional. It was a labor of love, and in a society that valued industriousness as a moral virtue. That labor was the gift's primary value. To create something useful and comforting from scraps and skill was to demonstrate one's good character. It showed thrift, care, and a refusal to be beaten down by hardship. A simple carved wooden toy or a doll stitched from fabric remnants told the same story. These were not the glossy, factory-made playthings of the wealthy. They were unique, imperfect, and imbued with the personality of their creator. A father might spend his few precious evening hours whittling a horse, his hands calloused from the factory or the field, demonstrating a surprising tenderness. This wasn't just a toy. It was a demonstration of paternal devotion and resourcefulness. In this context, a handmade gift wasn't a sign of poverty to be ashamed of. It was a badge of honor. It declared that even with limited means, the family possessed the true virtues, a strong work ethic, a sentimental heart, and the ingenuity to create happiness from almost nothing. Their gifts were their character references, written in wool and wood. If the working class gave from the heart, The Victorian middle class gave from a state of perpetual, gut-wrenching anxiety. This was the class on the rise, and they were terrified of falling. Desperate to distinguish themselves from the laboring masses they had only recently escaped, but painfully aware that they lacked the effortless grace of the aristocracy, they existed in a social purgatory. Their entire lives were a performance, a carefully staged play titled The Respectable Family. And Christmas was their opening night. Middle-class gifts were instruments of social warfare, weapons in the great campaign to prove their refinement. The goal was to strike a perfect, almost impossible balance. A gift had to be tasteful but not extravagant, personal but not intimate, fashionable but not faddish. It had to whisper, "We are cultured, educated, and morally upright," without screaming, "We are desperate social climbers who just discovered what a fish fork is." A gentleman might present his niece with a beautifully bound book, but it couldn't be just any book. A racy French novel was out of the question that suggested moral laxity. A book of complex philosophy might imply she was a blue stocking, a fate worse than death. The perfect choice was a volume of uplifting, morally unambiguous poetry, perhaps by Tennyson or Longfellow. The book itself, with its leather cover and gilt edges, signaled financial comfort and an appreciation for fine objects. Its contents signaled unimpeachable moral character and literary taste. It was a gift that did double duty, edifying the recipient while burnishing the reputation of the giver. For the women of the house, gift-giving was an opportunity to display their accomplishments, the genteel skills that proved they were ladies of leisure. A young woman might spend weeks hand-embroidering a bookmark with a delicate floral pattern or filling a scrapbook with pressed flowers, elegant calligraphy, and watercolor landscapes. These were not just presents. They were advertisements of her domestic virtue, her patience, and her artistic sensibility. They were tangible proof that she was not engaged in coarse manual labor, but in the delicate arts befitting her station. The quality of her stitching or the elegance of her handwriting would be quietly assessed by the recipient, a grade given on her suitability as a future wife and mother. The pressure to choose correctly was immense. The internal monologue of a middle-class matron shopping for a gift for her husband's business partner's wife would be a symphony of anxiety. A silver-plated card tray? Is that too forward? Does it suggest we think their visitors are of a higher caliber than our own? Or is it not silver-plated enough? Perhaps the embossed pattern is too florid a sign of new money vulgarity. Maybe a simple porcelain vase is better. But what if they think we couldn't afford the silver? Oh heavens, perhaps I'll just give her a jar of my own preserves and pray she doesn't think I'm suggesting her cook is incompetent. Every choice was a potential misstep on the treacherous tightrope of social mobility. Their gifts were not tokens of affection. They were carefully calculated moves in a lifelong game of social chess. For the true aristocracy, the rules of the game were entirely different. They weren't trying to climb the ladder. They were perched comfortably at the top, occasionally glancing down with mild amusement at the frantic scrambling below. Their gifts were not meant to prove anything. They were meant to reinforce a sense of effortless superiority and maintain a polite, emotional distance. Aristocratic gifts were typically expensive, exquisitely crafted, and almost breathtakingly impersonal. A hand-cut crystal inkstand, a gold-plated snuff box, a set of mother-of-pearl opera glasses, a case of fine cigars from a preferred London tobacconist. These were the currency of their class. The value of these gifts lay not in sentiment, but in their sheer, unadulterated luxury and their association with a life of leisure. An inkstand was for writing letters from one's country estate. Opera glasses were for attending the opera, a pursuit far removed from the daily grind. These objects were props in the grand theater of aristocratic life. Ironically, the handmade items so prized by the working class as labors of love were almost never exchanged among the wealthy. To give something you had stitched, carved, or painted yourself would have been a catastrophic faux pas. Why? Because it suggested you had engaged in manual labor. It implied you had the time and, even worse, the inclination to do something so ... industrious. In their world, true status was measured by how much labor you could command from others. Time was not something to be spent on crafting a sentimental object. Time was the ultimate luxury, something to be filled with leisurely pursuits, not work. A gift you made yourself hinted at a shocking lack of servants and a disturbing proximity to the middle-class value of doing. The impersonal nature of their gifts was a feature, not a bug. It kept messy, inconvenient emotions at bay. An expensive, elegant object fulfilled a social obligation perfectly. It acknowledged a relationship, be it kinship, friendship, or strategic alliance, without requiring any actual emotional investment. It was a transaction of taste, a polite nod to a shared world of privilege. It said, "We are of the same class. We appreciate the same fine things. This object confirms our mutual understanding. Now, let us not speak of it further." Ultimately, the Victorians read gifts with the same critical eye we might use to scan a resume or a social media profile today. A poorly chosen present was not a simple blunder. It was a character flaw made manifest. It could suggest you lacked taste, education, moral fortitude, or emotional intelligence. But a thoughtful, appropriate one calibrated perfectly to the recipient's station and your relationship to them was a quiet masterpiece of social communication. It could say, without a single word, "I am a person of substance. I am refined. I know the rules. I belong." So the next time you casually toss a gift into a bag and scribble a name on a tag, spare a thought for your Victorian ancestors. For them, that simple act was a declaration of their very identity, a performance upon which their entire social future might depend. When we think of the perfect Christmas gift today, we might imagine the latest gadget, a sentimental keepsake, or a beautifully wrapped surprise that fits the personality of the person receiving it. Our ideal is a testament to intimacy, a small, tangible piece of evidence that says, "I see you. I know you. I know you've been wanting an air fryer." But in Victorian England, the perfect gift had far less to do with personal desires and far more to do with symbolism, social cues, and crushing cultural expectations. A present was a reflection not only of the giver's taste and values, but also of what society deemed appropriate, moral, and refined. To give a gift was to submit your character for public inspection, and the perfect gift was one that passed with flying colors, pleasing not the individual, but the terrifying, invisible jury of everyone else. It was less about personal connection and more about social survival. One of the most cherished gifts among the lower and middle classes was something as simple, as humble as an orange. Yes, an orange. Before you dismiss this as the saddest Christmas present imaginable, you must recalibrate your mind to a time before global shipping and year-round produce. In the bleak, damp chill of a British winter, an orange was a luxury item, a small, fragrant treasure that carried the weight of indulgence and care. For a child from a working-class household, whose world was painted in shades of gray soot and brown fog. Finding one in their stocking was not just a treat, it was an event. It was a sphere of impossible, vibrant color in a colorless world. It was a scent that was utterly alien, a burst of sunshine in faraway lands that momentarily banished the smell of coal smoke and boiled laundry. It meant someone had spent their hard-earned, precious money on something purely delightful, not necessary, and that in itself was a miracle. That orange was a symbol, a declaration that even in a life of relentless practicality, there was room for a single, perfect moment of beauty. It was the perfect gift because its value was not in its substance, but in its sublime, delicious impracticality. As you climbed the treacherous, slippery ladder of Victorian society, the types of gifts naturally changed, becoming less about sentiment and more about signaling. Books were always a popular choice, particularly for the anxious, aspiring middle classes. But these were not the thrilling novels or scandalous poetry we might choose today. The perfect Victorian book was a tool of moral improvement, a brick in the wall of respectability. A handsomely bound volume of Tennyson's more patriotic poetry, or a carefully curated collection of sermons on the virtues of thrift and piety was the ideal. These books weren't just read often. They weren't read at all. They were displayed. Their fine leather bindings and gold-lettered spines adorned the parlor table or the mantelpiece like tiny literary status symbols, quietly broadcasting the family's taste, piety, and intellectual refinement to any visitor who might drop by for tea. Giving such a book was a masterstroke of social signaling. It flattered the recipient by implying they were a person of intellectual depth, while simultaneously reflecting brilliantly on the giver's own unimpeachable character. It was a gift that said, "We are both serious, morally upright people who appreciate the finer, more educational things in life. And no, I did not get you that French novel. You degenerate." For the truly fashionable middle and upper classes, who had already established their moral credentials, the perfect gift often came from abroad. Imported goods carried an air of elegance, worldliness, and, most importantly, expense. Items like opera glasses, ivory-handled parasols, or delicate silk fans were ideal presents. They were expensive enough to be impressive, but not so personal as to be intimate, a line that one crossed at their peril. These gifts were props for a life of leisure and culture, objects that would be used in the public sphere, further cementing one's social standing. They were also ruthlessly gender-specific, reinforcing the rigid order of the time. A gentleman might receive a silver-tipped walking stick, a symbol of his status as a man of property and leisure who enjoyed a constitutional stroll. A lady, meanwhile, might be delighted by a lace-trimmed handkerchief, an object designed for delicate dabbing and demure gestures. Each object had a role, a meaning, a place. The walking stick was for striding confidently through the world. The handkerchief was for gracefully weeping into it. The perfect gift was one that understood and upheld these distinctions, a cog in the great unyielding machine of social propriety. Even the act of making a gift by hand, which we might see as the ultimate personal gesture, was governed by a labyrinth of unspoken rules. A pressed flower album or a hand-embroidered handkerchief was a perfectly acceptable, even desirable, gift if it was made by a daughter, a niece, or a wife. In this context, the gift was not just an object. It was a showcase. It demonstrated the three pillars of ideal Victorian womanhood: time, effort, and domestic skill. It was tangible proof that the young lady in question was patient, artistic, and not engaged in any unseemly, paid labor. Her handiwork was a testament to her virtue and her value on the marriage market. But for that same young woman to hand-make a gift for someone significantly above her station, a social catastrophe, it would be seen as presumptuous, an attempt to force an intimacy that was not socially sanctioned. It was like sending a friend request to the Queen. The act of creation, so virtuous in one context, became an act of social climbing in another. The perfect handmade gift was one that knew its place. Practicality, too, played a key role in the Victorian gift-giving calculus, especially among the middle classes who prized usefulness and order as cardinal virtues. Stationery sets, handsome sewing kits, or sturdy writing desks were highly valued presents. They spoke to a life of organized correspondence, diligent mending, and serious intellectual pursuits. These were gifts that endorsed a well-run, respectable household. But even here, danger lurked. The choice of a practical gift had to be executed with surgical precision. A writing desk that was too ornate, with too much carving and inlay, might come off as frivolous and flashy, the mark of new money vulgarity. But a desk that was too plain, too starkly functional, could seem thoughtless, cheap, or even insulting. The giver had to find the perfect, agonizing middle ground. An object that was clearly of good quality but restrained in its design. One that whispered tasteful prosperity, rather than shouting, "Look how much I spent," or muttering, "This is all I could afford." So, what, in the end, made the perfect Victorian gift? It was never, ever about what someone secretly longed for in the quiet of their own heart. It was about what they were supposed to want, what aligned with their station, their gender, their public image, and their moral obligations. The perfect gift was appropriate, tasteful, modest, unless it was for an aristocrat, in which case it had to be immodestly expensive, but presented with modesty, and brimming with silent, coded messages that everyone but the recipient was meant to understand. It had to please not just the person whose name was on the tag, but the watchful, judgmental eyes of their family, their friends, their rivals, and their neighbors. In other words, the perfect gift wasn't for one person at all. It was an offering laid at the altar of society itself, a carefully chosen sacrifice to the great, insatiable god of appearances. Today, the act of wrapping a gift is half the fun, a ritual steeped in the satisfying rip of glossy paper and the cheerful tackiness of a pre-made bow. We wade through aisles of wrapping paper, choosing between dancing snowmen and elegant geometric patterns, our biggest challenge being the structural integrity of the tape. But in Victorian England, the modern concept of gift wrap, as we know, it simply didn't exist. There were no mass-produced rolls of Santa pattern paper, no glittery bows that shed their sparkle on every available surface, and certainly no gift bags for the lazy and time-poor. Yet, to assume this meant Victorians were careless about presentation would be a grave miscalculation. Far from it. In the absence of convenience, they elevated gift presentation to an art form, a competitive sport, and occasionally a descent into downright bizarre, elaborate madness. For the Victorians, wrapping was less about concealment and more about elegant display and symbolic meaning. The goal wasn't to hide the gift but to frame it, to build a sense of occasion around it. A present might be nestled inside a decorative box made of lacquered wood or paper match, its lid adorned with a miniature painting of a serene pastoral scene. Wealthier families, never ones to miss an opportunity for ostentation, would have custom cases made for specific items. A set of silver fish forks wouldn't just be handed over. It would be presented in a box lined with deep blue velvet, each fork nestled in its own perfectly molded indentation, the whole affair secured with an engraved silver clasp. The box itself was a statement, a silent testament to the giver's wealth and exquisite taste. Sometimes, a gift might come in a hand-carved wooden container so intricate and beautiful that it was, without question, more valuable than the modest trinket it held within. One can only imagine the polite, strained smile of someone receiving a single, unremarkable button inside a box that looked like it belonged in a museum, the unspoken message being, "I have spent a fortune on the container for this worthless object, because that is the kind of person I am." The playful and inventive middle class, ever eager to demonstrate their wit and creativity, often turned gift presentation into a game. It wasn't uncommon for a gift to be hidden inside multiple layers of fabric or paper, a sort of genteel, domestic version of Pass the Parcel, where the prize wasn't a cheap plastic toy but perhaps a single, terrifyingly fragile porcelain thimble. The unwrapping became a performance, a slow, deliberate excavation through layers of tissue and ribbon, each one heightening the anticipation. Sometimes, the presentation was a feat of miniature engineering. A small piece of jewelry or a coin might be placed inside a walnut shell, which was then painstakingly glued back together, sealed with a drop of wax, and tied with a single, elegant thread. The recipient would be presented with what appeared to be a simple nut, only to discover the hidden treasure within, a trick that was sure to elicit a gasp of delight and a mental note from all onlookers that the giver was both clever and charmingly whimsical. This love of puzzles and surprises extended to more elaborate contraptions. A simple note, perhaps a clue to where the real gift was hidden in a treasure hunt around the house, might be slipped inside a hollowed-out book. Or, for the truly dedicated, a gift might be secured inside a handmade puzzle box, a contraption of moving parts and hidden slides that required logic and patience to open. This turned the act of receiving a gift into an intellectual challenge. It was a way of saying, not only am I giving you this lovely brooch, but I am also testing your intelligence. Do try to keep up. It was a world away from the brute force of tearing paper. It was a delicate and sometimes maddening dance of wits. Even the choice of material was a language in itself, a subtle broadcast of one's class and values. The humble brown paper, often used by the working class, was not seen as crude or cheap. In the Victorian mindset, it was neat, practical, and modest. To wrap a gift carefully in clean brown paper and tie it with a simple string was to demonstrate the virtues of thrift, care, and cleanliness. It was an honest presentation, free of pretense. As you moved up the social ladder, the materials became more delicate and decorative. The upper classes might use sheets of colored tissue paper, a fragile and expensive commodity, to swaddle their gifts. Silk ribbons, lace, and even scraps of brocade fabric were used to convey a sense of luxury and elegance. Some families, with an eye for the romantic, would press flowers and ferns into their packaging, creating a small botanical collage. The most status-conscious would seal their parcels with a drop of colored wax, stamped firmly with a family crest or a personal monogram, a clear and unmistakable power move that declared, "This gift comes from a person of lineage and importance." Be suitably impressed. Victorians also understood with chilling clarity that how a gift was delivered could carry as much weight as the gift itself. The method of delivery was another layer of meaning, another part of the intricate social performance. A present sent by post, for example, could be interpreted in several ways. It might imply certain emotional distance, a formality between business associates, perhaps. Or, in the case of a clandestine courtship, it could be a tool of strategic discretion, a way to send a gift without the prying eyes and the disapproving family. On the other hand, the act of having a liveried servant deliver a parcel on your behalf was a powerful reinforcement of the social order. The very presence of the servant, standing stiffly at the door with a beribboned box on a silver tray, was part of the gift. It was a display of wealth and status, a reminder of the giver's position in the world. The location of the delivery was also deeply significant. Leaving a gift in a particular spot within the home could signal a wealth of information about the relationship between giver and receiver. A gift left on the hall table was a formal, public gesture. But a gift left on the recipient's personal writing desk, or, more intimately still, in their private sitting room, was a sign of familiarity and affection. For a suitor to have his gift placed directly in a young lady's room was a bold move, a clear signal of serious romantic interest, and a presumed level of intimacy that would set tongues wagging for weeks. For the most sentimental and literary among them, no gift was complete without a written accompaniment. There was a popular tradition of attaching poems, riddles, or short verses to a present, usually written in careful, elegant calligraphy on a small card. These lines were often gently humorous or sweetly moralistic, offering not just entertainment but another window into the giver's character and wit. Even the most mundane of gifts could be elevated into something charming and memorable with the addition of a clever rhyme. A simple bar of soap might be accompanied by a verse like, "To wash away the winter's grime and make you clean for Christmas time." A pair of hand-knitted socks could be transformed from a purely practical item into a token of affection with a line such as, "May these warm socks your comfort be, and make you think, dear friend, of me." This practice added a layer of personality and warmth, a final, thoughtful touch that proved the giver had invested not just money, but time and intellect. So, while the Victorians may not have had wrapping paper aisles to browse or glittery gift bags to fall back on, they didn't need them. Their approach to presentation was infinitely more complex and meaningful. They wrapped their gifts in creativity, in symbolism, in puzzles, and in meticulous, painstaking care. It wasn't just about what was inside the box. It was about crafting an experience, a message, a moment. Their methods were sometimes strange, often subtle, and always intentional, creating a rich and layered ritual that makes our modern rip and reveal feel like a rather blunt instrument by comparison. In the candlelit drawing rooms of Victorian England, where propriety reigned supreme and genuine emotions were kept more tightly corseted than the ladies themselves, the Christmas season offered a rare, terrifying, and utterly thrilling opportunity. For the unmarried men and women navigating the treacherous, shark-infested waters of courtship, a Christmas gift was more than just a festive token. It was a secret weapon. It was a coded message, a whispered promise, a declaration of war on the stifling conventions of the day. A gift could say what words, chaperones, and a paralyzing fear of social ruin would never permit. But this was a high-stakes game. One misstep, one overly bold gesture, one poorly chosen trinket, and the gentle whisper of affection could become a deafening roar of scandal that could shatter reputations, end courtships, and provide the local gossips with enough material to last them through Easter. Victorian society, particularly when it came to the fairer sex, was obsessed with appearances. A young woman's reputation was a delicate, gossamer thing, as easily torn as a silk stocking and infinitely harder to repair. Her every action, every word, every glance was scrutinized, catalogued, and judged. Any hint of impropriety, however small, could cast a shadow not just on her own marital prospects, but on the standing of her entire family. So, when a gentleman decided to offer a Christmas gift to a lady who was not yet his fiancée, he was not merely shopping. He was walking a tightrope over a canyon of social annihilation. The line between charmingly attentive and scandalously forward was as thin and sharp as a needle, and the wrong present could quickly transform a private sentiment into a very public spectacle. Something as seemingly innocent as a glove or a brooch was, in this charged atmosphere, laden with hidden meaning. A pair of fine kid gloves, for instance, was a masterclass in ambiguity. On the surface, it was a perfectly respectable item of apparel, but symbolically, it was electric. It represented a desire for touch, a longing to be close to her hands, an intimacy that was deliciously suggestive, yet just deniable enough to escape outright condemnation. A locket, on the other hand, was a far more dangerous gambit. To give a woman a small, heart-shaped container designed to hold a miniature portrait or a lock of hair was bordering on a public declaration of love. It was a gesture typically reserved for official engagements, a sign of serious, long-term intentions. To bestow such a gift upon a woman to whom you were not formally betrothed was seen by many as breathtakingly presumptuous, if not downright improper. It was the social equivalent of marking your territory, and if her father disapproved, you'd find both the locket and yourself swiftly ejected from the house. It wasn't just what was given, it was how. The mechanics of the exchange were as fraught with peril as the gift itself. A gift handed over in a quiet, unchaperoned moment could be enough to arouse suspicion. A note tucked inside, no matter how innocent its contents, could fan the flames of scandal into a raging inferno if discovered by a hawk-eyed aunt. To mitigate these risks, many a clever suitor relied on the art of the intermediary. A trusted sister, a sympathetic cousin, or even a discreet family servant could be employed to deliver the gift, providing a crucial layer of plausible deniability. The suitor could later claim, with a straight face, that the book of romantic poetry was intended for the entire family's enjoyment, and it was simply a coincidence that it ended up in the hands of the one daughter he was desperately in love with. Others leaned into the power of subtlety, offering gifts that seemed neutral on the surface, but carried a powerful romantic payload. A book of poetry by Lord Byron, or a piece of sheet music titled "I Dream of Thee," was a clear signal to the intended recipient, while appearing to her parents as a perfectly respectable contribution to her cultural education. For the young women hoping to encourage a suitor without appearing unladylike, the rules were just as convoluted and twice as restrictive. A woman could not be seen to be the pursuer. Her role was to be a flower, patiently waiting to be picked by the most suitable gardener. But she could, with great care, subtly indicate which gardener she preferred. The handmade gift was her primary tool. To create something with her own hands was to offer a piece of her time and her skill. A deeply personal gesture that was still considered acceptably domestic. An embroidered bookmark was perhaps the perfect offering. It was humble, it was useful for a respectable pastime, and it would live intimately between the pages of his book, a constant, silent reminder of her affection. A small watercolor painting of a pleasant landscape showcased her artistic accomplishments, another prized wifely virtue. But even here, she had to be careful. A handmade gift that was too elaborate or too fine risked looking desperate, as if she were trying too hard to impress. A gift that was too personal, say, a pair of embroidered slippers, was a shocking breach of decorum, suggesting a level of domestic familiarity that was reserved for wives. Even something as sweet and simple as a handkerchief, a classic token of female affection, had to be handled with care. A neat, simple monogram was acceptable. But a handkerchief that was trimmed with too much lace, or, heaven forbid, scented with her own personal perfume, could be misread as a signal of inappropriate boldness, a sign that she was perhaps a little too French in her sensibilities. And yet, for all the danger and anxiety, Christmas was one of the few times of the year when such delicate exchanges were socially permissible, at least in small, carefully controlled doses. Under the general amnesty of festive cheer, with families gathered and gifts being exchanged in the semi-public chaos of the drawing room, the rules could be bent ever so slightly. The warmth of the season, the scent of pine and roasting meat, and the general spirit of goodwill allowed for just enough softness in the rigid social structure to let a little affection breathe briefly. A gift might not lead directly to a proposal, but it could open a door. It could start a conversation. It could plant a seed of hope or confirm a suspicion of mutual feeling that had previously only been communicated through fleeting, charged glances across a crowded room. For Victorian couples in waiting, love often had to wear a mask, hiding its true face behind a veneer of polite indifference. The Christmas gift was a rare, flickering moment when that mask could be allowed to slip, just for an instant. A carefully chosen ribbon, a pressed flower tucked inside a book, a verse of poetry copied out in a delicate hand. These were small things, fragile things, easily dismissed by the uninitiated as mere trifles. But to the right person, in that silent, coded language of the heart, they could mean everything. They were lifelines of hope, whispered secrets passed in plain sight, a testament to the enduring power of love to find a way, even in the most restrictive of circumstances. In our modern world, the act of regifting is a guilty little secret, a minor transgression whispered to a close friend with a nervous laugh and a hasty disclaimer. But it was still in the box. They'll never know. It's a crime of convenience, a shortcut born of holiday, fatigue, and the awkwardness of receiving a singing fish from a well-meaning but deeply misguided relative. But in Victorian England, a society that could turn even the simple act of drinking tea into a minefield of social etiquette, regifting wasn't just a holiday convenience. It was a subtle, strategic, and often perilous art form. It was governed by the same complex, unspoken web of rules and social awareness that wrapped itself around every other aspect of the season, transforming a simple act of recycling into a high-stakes performance of character. The Victorians lived in a state of perpetual, agonizing conflict between two opposing forces: thrift and appearance. Thrift was a moral virtue, a cornerstone of the Protestant work ethic, praised in sermons and penny dreadfuls alike. To be wasteful was to be sinful. Appearance, on the other hand, was a social necessity. The armor one wore to battle for respectability and status. To appear poor or careless was to risk social oblivion. Regifting, therefore, became the delicate, nerve-wracking tightrope walk between these two poles. It was a practice common enough to be quietly accepted in all but the highest echelons of society, but it came with a set of rules so strict, so absolute, that to break them was to risk not just embarrassment, but a permanent stain on your reputation. First, and most sacred, was the Golden Rule, the 11th commandment of Victorian social conduct. Thou shalt never, ever regift upward. To pass a second-hand or unwanted gift to someone above your social station was a blunder of such catastrophic proportions that it could curdle the very air in the room. It suggested not only a shocking lapse in judgment, but a fundamental failure to comprehend the delicate ecosystem of respect that underpinned the rigid social hierarchy. Imagine, if you will, a humble clerk, Mr. Poodle, receiving a handsome, if slightly ostentatious silver-plated inkwell from his wife's aunt. It doesn't quite suit his modest desk, and in a moment of what he mistakes for brilliant inspiration, he decides to pass it along to his formidable employer, Mr. Grimstone, as a Christmas token. He polishes it, wraps it neatly, and presents it with a hopeful smile. Mr. Grimstone accepts it with a non-committal grunt, but the damage is done. The inkwell, which might have been a perfectly acceptable gift had it been purchased new for the occasion, is now a symbol of Mr. Poodle's audacity. It silently screams, "I hold you in such low esteem that I've given you my leftovers." It implies a familiarity that does not exist and a carelessness that is unforgivable in a man of business. Mr. Poodle will not be fired, of course. That would be far too direct. But a certain chill will enter his professional life. He will be overlooked for the promotion. His opinions will carry a little less weight, and he will never, ever understand why. The inkwell, a silent, silver-plated assassin, will have done its work. On the other hand, regifting downward from a wealthier individual to someone of a lower station was not only socially acceptable, but could even be framed as an act of virtuous charity. This was a crucial part of the performance of paternalism, the delicate dance of power that allowed the upper classes to feel generous while reinforcing their own superiority. A well-off lady, for instance, might find herself with a piece of costume jewelry, a brooch or a string of beads, that was no longer in fashion. She would not simply toss it aside. Instead, she might summon her lady's maid and present it to her with a warm, benevolent smile. "Mary," she might say, "I find I have no more use for this little trinket, and I thought it might bring you some small pleasure." This was not seen as stingy. It was seen as thoughtful. The lady was praised for her lack of waste and her kindness to her inferiors. Mary, for her part, was expected to be overcome with gratitude for this second-hand bauble, which she would likely never be able to afford herself. The same principle applied to children's toys. Last year's doll, perhaps a little worn from play, would be given a new hand-sewn frock and passed down to the coachman's daughter. It was an act of generosity, provided it was done with an air of dignity and warmth. A performance that benefited everyone involved and kept the social order perfectly intact. The key to any successful regifting operation, whether upward, downward, or sideways, was presentation. This was where the real artistry lay. A regifted item had to be laundered of its past, scrubbed clean of any hint that it ever belonged to someone else. The goal was not merely to pass it off as new, but to give the object a new life, a new identity. A book, for example, was a common candidate for regifting, but it required careful preparation. Any inscription from the original giver had to be discreetly removed, a process that sometimes involved the careful replacement of an entire page. The book would be thoroughly dusted, its pages aired, and its cover polished. For a truly high-stakes regift, one might even have it rebound in new leather, a significant expense undertaken purely to erase its history. It would then be presented with a thoughtful, handwritten note, drawing attention to its literary merits and away from its mysterious origins. A physical object, like a vase or trinket box, had to be polished to within an inch of its life. It would be tucked into a fresh pouch, nestled in a new bed of tissue paper, or placed in a pristine box. Any sign of wear, any tiny scratch or faded spot, was a fatal flaw. The register became a forensic expert, examining the object for any trace evidence of its former life. The humiliation of being caught was simply too great to risk carelessness. Stories circulated in hushed tones over tea and biscuit staleys of social horror that served as cautionary fables for all. There was the tale of Mrs. Gable, who received a beautiful hand-embroidered handkerchief from a friend, only to realize, with a slow dawning wave of nausea, that the delicate, curling monogram in the corner was in fact her own. The handkerchief had been a gift she had made and given to a mutual acquaintance 6 months prior. The silence that followed this discovery was said to have been profound and lasting. The friendship, needless to say, did not survive. Timing and social geography were also critical factors. To register an item within the same calendar year was to play with fire. To register it within the same immediate social circle was to commit social suicide. One had to have a keen memory and a strategic mind. The ideal regift involved a long-distance transfer. An unwanted gift from a cousin in London could, after a suitable quarantine period of at least 1 year, be safely deployed to an unsuspecting friend in Bath. The geographical distance provided a crucial buffer, minimizing the risk of the gift's history ever coming to light. The register had to maintain a mental inventory of who gave them what, and when, a complex social ledger that would have baffled a modern accountant. But perhaps the most important and most quintessentially Victorian rule of regifting was intention. At its most refined, regifting was not supposed to be a lazy or cynical act. It was meant to be a thoughtful, even creative, exercise in social utility. If a gift was genuinely unsuitable for you, a book on a topic that bored you to tears, a colorless shawl that made you look deathly ill, the polite and proper course of action was not to toss it into a dark cupboard to gather dust. It was to engage in a process of thoughtful reallocation. You were to consider your circle of friends and relations and ask yourself, who would this gift suit? Who would genuinely appreciate this book? Who would look radiant in this ghastly color? In this way, the object's value wasn't diminished. It was redirected. It was repurposed with grace and tact. The act became one of matchmaking, of finding the right home for an unloved object. In a society where resources were often precious and appearances were everything, regifting became a kind of quiet, underground economy of taste and social grace. It was a testament to the Victorian ability to make a virtue out of a necessity, to wrap a practical act in layers of complex social meaning. Done well, it reflected prudence, generosity, and a keen understanding of human nature. Done poorly, it revealed carelessness, disrespect, or, worst of all, a lack of social awareness. Either way, it was never just about the object. It was about the intricate, unspoken message it carried, a message that could build a bridge or burn one to the ground. It was a game of subtlety and risk, played with second-hand objects and first-rate social skills, a practice that makes our own furtive attempts at regifting look like child's play. In the warm, flickering glow of a Victorian Christmas, a season already fraught with more social peril than a royal wedding, the question of what to give was always a complicated dance of etiquette and anxiety, simmering just beneath the surface of every potential present, from a simple bookmark to a silver snuff box. lay an even thornier, more character-defining dilemma. Should you buy it, or should you make it yourself? The answer, like most things in that rigidly structured society, was not a matter of personal preference. It depended entirely on who you were, who the recipient was, and where you both stood on the great, slippery, and mercilessly judged pyramid of class and propriety. This was not a simple choice between convenience and sentiment. It was a public declaration of your values, your financial situation, and your very understanding of your place in the world. For the vast majority of Victorians, the working and lower middle classes who formed the backbone of the nation, the choice to make a gift was not really a choice at all. It was a necessity, a reality dictated by the simple, unyielding fact that money was tight and store-bought goods were luxuries reserved for the rarest of occasions. But to view this as a sad compromise would be to fundamentally misunderstand the culture. In these households, a handmade gift was not a sign of poverty to be ashamed of. It was a badge of honor, a testament to the virtues of resourcefulness, devotion, and love. The time and effort poured into such creations gave them an emotional weight and a value that no factory-produced item could ever possess. A mother might spend her evenings by the dim, flickering light of a candle, her fingers sore and her eyes strained, sewing a doll for her daughter from precious scraps of fabric. A father, his hands calloused and stiff from a day of hard labor, might patiently carve a set of alphabet blocks from a discarded piece of wood, sanding each letter with a tenderness that belied his rough exterior. These gifts were cherished not just for what they were, but for the powerful, unspoken message they carried. They said, "I have very little, but I give you what is most precious to me, my time, my skill, my care." A tin of homemade sweets, a hand-knitted scarf, a simple wooden toy. These were not just objects. They were tangible pieces of affection, lovingly crafted in the stolen moments of a life defined by work. Among families and close-knit communities, these items were received with a gratitude that was deep and genuine. The quality of the stitching, the smoothness of the wood, the sweetness of the jam, these were not just details. They were measures of love. In this world, the act of making was an act of devotion, a quiet but profound testament to the strength of human connection in the face of hardship. But as you ascended the social ladder into the precarious, anxiety-ridden realm of the Victorian middle class, the clear, wholesome virtue of the handmade gift began to curdle. The middle class existed in a constant state of social vertigo, desperately aspiring to the effortless gentility of the aristocracy while living in mortal fear of being mistaken for the common laboring poor they had only recently surpassed. For them, every choice was a performance, every possession a prop, and the handmade gift became a particularly complicated and dangerous instrument. On one hand, to craft something yourself, especially if you were a woman, was to demonstrate a host of desirable virtues. It showed skill, patience, morality, and industriousness. A young lady who could produce a beautifully embroidered handkerchief or a delicate watercolor painting was advertising herself as a model of domestic accomplishment, a future wife who would manage her household with grace and diligence. On the other hand, the very act of making something with your own hands carried the terrifying risk of seeming, well, poor. It could suggest that you couldn't afford to simply buy a suitable gift, a devastating admission of financial inadequacy. It could look too earnest, too try-hard, lacking the detached, effortless elegance they so desperately wished to project. To give a handmade gift was to walk a fine line between appearing virtuous and appearing vulgar. To navigate this treacherous terrain, many middle-class Victorians became masters of the hybrid gift, a brilliant and slightly neurotic compromise that split the difference between buying and making. A young lady might purchase a fine leather-bound notebook, thus proving she had the means to shop at a respectable stationer's, and then spend weeks personalizing it. She would fill its pages with her most elegant calligraphy, painstakingly transcribing moral aphorisms or uplifting verses of poetry. She would press flowers between its pages, creating a delicate, sentimental collage. The result was a gift that felt deeply personal, while still being rooted in a respectable commercial transaction. It maintained the illusion of refinement while showcasing her artistic and moral sensibilities. A gentleman might engage in a similar strategy, purchasing a modest but tasteful item, a simple silver locket, perhaps, and pairing it with a handwritten poem he had composed himself. The locket said, "I have the financial means to purchase jewelry for you," while the poem said, "I also have a sensitive, artistic soul." This hybrid approach was the perfect solution for a class obsessed with having it both ways. It allowed them to perform both wealth and virtue, to appear both fashionable and heartfelt, and, most importantly, to navigate the Christmas season without committing a fatal social error that would see them cast down the ladder of respectability. Once you reached the rarefied air of the wealthy elite, the rules flipped entirely. Among the aristocracy, the handmade gift was not only rare, but often actively discouraged. A lady of means might engage in a little light embroidery or watercolor painting as a genteel leisure activity, a way to pass the time between social calls and managing the staff. But to actually give away something she had made with her own two hands, the very idea was faintly horrifying. It could suggest, heaven forbid, that she had too much time on her hands, a sign of a poor social calendar. Even worse, it hinted at manual labor, an activity that was the exclusive domain of the lower classes. In their world, one's status was directly proportional to the amount of work one didn't do. For the upper crust, the perfect gift was elegant, impersonal, and, above all, purchased from a source of impeccable reputation. Imported goods, luxury novelties from Paris, or items bearing the mark of a well-known and reassuringly expensive craftsmen were far more acceptable than anything produced in the home. The value of a gift was not in the labor of the giver, but in the exquisite taste and judgment required to select it. The effort was not in the making, but in the choosing. A true aristocrat demonstrated their worth not by stitching a bookmark, but by knowing which silversmith in London was the most fashionable, which tobacconist imported the finest cigars, or which jeweler could be trusted to provide a diamond of sufficient size and clarity. Yet even in this world of fine china and silver trinkets, the idea of effort still held weight. It just took a different, more detached form. The careful selection of the object was paramount. It had to be perfectly suited to the recipient's status. The presentation had to be flawless, perhaps involving a custom-made case or the finest imported tissue paper. And the timing and method of delivery had to be executed with military precision, often by a servant, to maintain a polite and proper distance. It wasn't the hands that made the gift that mattered. It was the judgment that chose it and the wealth that commanded its flawless presentation. The effort was intellectual and financial, not physical, a crucial distinction that separated them from the striving masses below. So, while the act of giving a gift crossed all class lines, the method revealed everything. Whether it was hand-stitched with love in a cramped cottage, or coolly selected from a glittering Bond Street showroom, A Victorian gift was never just a gesture. It was a signal, a confession, a detailed report on your financial situation, your moral compass, and your social aspirations. It was a glimpse into what you could afford, what you truly valued, and, most of all, how well you understood the intricate, unwritten rules of your place in the world. In the glittering, gaslit halls of Victorian mansions, Christmas shimmered with a kind of aggressive opulence. It was a season of candlelight glinting on polished silver, of rustling silk gowns, and of tables groaning under the weight of geese so plump they seemed positively indecent. But miles away from this festive theater, in the cramped kitchens and chilly back rooms of England's sprawling, smoke-choked working-class neighborhoods, the holiday looked, sounded, and smelled very different. There were no lavish tables piled high with imported delicacies, no jeweled trinkets nestled in velvet boxes, and no mountain of silk-wrapped packages waiting beneath a towering, perfectly decorated fir tree. And yet, for the millions of families who live this reality, Christmas was no less meaningful. In fact, it may have been more so, precisely because every small joy, every single gift, no matter how humble, came with the undeniable, palpable weight of sacrifice and love. For the working-class Victorian, money was not just scarce. It was a slippery, malevolent ghost that haunted every waking moment. Most families lived in a state of perpetual financial vertigo, teetering on the edge of ruin, their existence measured out in shillings and pence. The arrival of December did not magically suspend this reality. Instead, it presented a formidable challenge, a seemingly impossible equation of want versus means. And yet, when the time came, people made room. Somehow, they squeezed a little extra joy from a budget that had no business being squeezed. They performed small, domestic miracles of accounting, turning a few pennies saved here and a half-day's extra work there into a flicker of festive light. Christmas in these homes wasn't about luxury. It was about a stubborn, quiet determination to celebrate in defiance of circumstance. It was an act of resourcefulness, a testament to tradition, and a powerful declaration that even in the bleakest of winters, there would be warmth. The gifts exchanged in these households were rarely, if ever, purchased from a shop. They were born of ingenuity and necessity, pieced together from the scraps of cloth, the offcuts of wood, and the leftover materials from a long day's work. A father who spent his days in a deafening carpentry shop, his hands raw and splintered, might spend his precious few evening hours by the fire, patiently carving a spinning top for his son from a discarded block of wood. A mother whose fingers were numb from long hours at the textile mill might sit by candlelight, her eyes aching, sewing a doll for her daughter from leftover fabric scraps, stuffing its lumpy body with rags and embroidering a cheerful, slightly lopsided smile with a stolen bit of thread. These were not placeholder presents, not sad substitutes for the real thing. They were often labors of pure, unadulterated love, shaped in the quiet moments after the children were asleep, carefully hidden away until the morning of December 25th. The value of such a gift was measured not in its cost, but in the exhaustion it represented, the hours of rest sacrificed at its altar. Food, in a world where hunger was a constant low-level hum, became a kind of gift in itself, the ultimate expression of festive indulgence. A single perfect orange, bought with pennies saved over weeks, could be a child's greatest treasure. It was not just a piece of fruit. It was an object of almost mystical significance. It was an exotic jewel from a sun-drenched land they could barely imagine. Its vibrant color, a shock against the drabness of their surroundings. Its fragrant peel a perfume that momentarily banished the smell of damp and coal smoke. To be given an orange was to be given a small, edible piece of magic. Families would often pool their meager coins with neighbors to buy a small joint of meat or a bit of precious sugar and sue it for a Christmas pudding. The resulting meal, which might seem pitifully small to our modern eyes, was a feast of epic proportions. It was a banquet not taken for granted, but savored with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Every bite was the result of weeks of careful budgeting, planning, and community support, a shared victory against the daily grind. The children in these working-class homes often received gifts that were breathtakingly modest. Perhaps a paper toy from a penny newspaper, a warm book passed down from a more fortunate neighbor, or a hand-knit scarf, its wool a little coarse but its stitches tight and warm. But what these gifts lacked in quantity or polish, they more than made up for in meaning. Because in these homes, the holiday spirit didn't arrive in a sleigh from the North Pole. It was painstakingly assembled from the inside out. It was built from intention. Every careful stitch in a mitten, every precious crumb of a shared meat pie, every carefully folded note tucked into a mended stocking spoke of a love that was fierce, resilient, and enduring. This was not the passive, purchased joy of the wealthy. This was a joy that had been fought for, earned, and built by hand. Of course, a little charity often trickled down from the world above, a gesture that was both a blessing and a complicated reminder of their place. Local churches and Sunday schools might give out small parcels of hard candy, or, if they were particularly well-funded that year, a single glorious orange to each child. Employers who fancied themselves paternal figures, benevolent lords of their own industrial manners, occasionally distributed Christmas boxes to their workers. These might contain a small cash bonus, a sack of coal to ward off the worst of the winter chill, or a cut of meat. While genuinely helpful, these gestures were rarely free of subtext. They were practical acts of kindness that also served as subtle, powerful reminders of the class divide. They were kindness with strings attached, reinforcing loyalty and a sense of grateful dependence. The gift was a tool to boost morale, certainly, but also to keep the workforce docile and appreciative of their lot. Still, within the four walls of a working-class home, insulated for a single day from the noise of the factory and the judgment of the outside world, Christmas could feel truly magical. It was one of the few days in the year when the relentless routine was broken, when families could gather not in exhaustion, but in celebration, and when they could allow themselves to hope. The air might be chilly and the decorations sparse, but the room was filled with a richness that could not be bought. Even if the gift was humble, even if it was only a warm meal shared together, a single knitted glove, or a worn book wrapped in newspaper, it was real, it was heartfelt. And in its raw, unvarnished sincerity, it was, in many ways, richer, deeper, and far more true to the spirit of the season than anything found under the most gilded of trees in the most opulent of drawing rooms. In the Victorian imagination, that grand, gaslit theater of propriety and progress, childhood was something sacred, if carefully contained and frequently disinfected. Children were seen not as the loud, sticky, chaotic creatures we know and love today, but as miniature adults in training, lumps of raw, impressionable clay waiting to be molded into respectable, God-fearing, and productive members of society. And what better moment than the hallowed festival of Christmas to deliver not only a moment of delight, but also a hefty dose of moral instruction. For Victorian parents, especially among the anxious, aspiring middle and upper classes. The gifts they placed in their children's chubby, expectant hands on Christmas morning were never just toys. They were tools. They were vehicles for virtue, blueprints for future behavior, and cleverly disguised lessons in how not to be a disappointment to God, Queen, and country. This was the golden age of the improving gift, a concept that could suck the spontaneous joy out of even the most delightful-looking plaything. The goal of a gift was not merely to entertain. It was to edify, to instruct, to build character, and to gently, relentlessly steer a young soul away from the primrose path of idleness and frivolity. Dolls, for instance, were a Christmas staple, but they were rarely the glamorous, fashion-forward figures of today. The respectable Victorian doll was a stern moral tutor in miniature. She would arrive dressed in a modest, high-necked frock of brown or gray, her painted-on expression one of serene, slightly judgmental piety. She was often named something wholesome and unthreatening, like Mary, Jane, or Prudence, and she served not as a companion for wild adventures, but as a silent model of good conduct. She might come equipped with a miniature tea set for practicing polite hospitality, a tiny broom for rehearsing domestic cleanliness, or a set of miniature Bibles for her to read during her imaginary quiet time. The message, delivered with every stilted pose and every tiny, appropriate accessory, was crystal clear. Even in the wild, untamed wilderness of your imagination, you will behave properly. You will pour tea with your pinky extended. You will sweep up your imaginary dust, and you will not, under any circumstances, allow your doll to engage in behavior unbecoming of a lady. Books were perhaps the most favored and potent weapon in the parental arsenal of improvement. They were small, relatively affordable, and could be packed with more life lessons than a Sunday sermon. The stockings of well-to-do Victorian children were practically groaning with them. But these were not tales of wizards or whimsical adventures. The popular titles of the day were more like moral medicine, coated in a thin, often unconvincing layer of story. Books with titles like The Daisy Chain, Ministering Children, or A Peep Behind the Scenes were filled with saccharine, cautionary tales of unnervingly obedient children, harrowing moral trials, and the glorious, heavenly rewards that awaited those who did as they were told. A typical story might feature a pale, saintly child named Little Emily who resists the temptation to steal a lump of sugar and is rewarded by not immediately dying of consumption. A naughty, spirited friend who not only steals the sugar but enjoys it inevitably meets a grim educational end, perhaps by falling into a well or being trampled by a horse. The moral was always clear, capitalized, and underlined. Virtue is rewarded, and disobedience leads to an early grave. Even the picture books, with their charming illustrations of rosy-cheeked children and fluffy lambs, came with captions designed to instruct. A picture of a boy sharing his apple would be accompanied by a reminder that a generous heart is pleasing to the Lord. A drawing of a girl mending her sock would be captioned, "An idle hand is the devil's workshop." There was no escape. Fun was simply a vehicle for a lecture. Boys, meanwhile, were being groomed for their future roles as pillars of industry, commerce, and empire, and their toys reflected this solemn duty. A young boy might receive a miniature set of carpentry tools, not for the simple joy of banging things, but to instill in him the profound moral value of manual labor. A set of lead soldiers was not just for staging epic battles on the nursery floor. It was an introduction to the concepts of duty, discipline, strategy, and the unquestionable glory of expanding the British Empire across the globe. As he lined up his tiny redcoats, he was absorbing a lesson in patriotism and martial order. Games were highly encouraged, but only those that involved a healthy dose of learning. Puzzles that taught geography, card games that drilled spelling and arithmetic, or tedious board games that involved moving a counter through a series of moral choices were all popular. These were not just games. They were lessons in patience, logic, and self-control, designed to train the mind for the serious business of adult life. The idea of a game played purely for its own chaotic, pointless fun would have been viewed with deep suspicion. But not all children lived in a world of improving books and educational toys. In the cramped, cold homes of the working class, Christmas gifts were far simpler, sometimes consisting of a single handmade item or a small, precious treat. Yet even here, in the absence of material wealth, the emphasis on character remained, albeit in a different form. A mother might spend her precious, exhausted evenings carving out time to sew a small cloth doll for her daughter, or knitting a pair of mittens to keep her son's hands warm. These gifts were not just functional. They were powerful, tangible expressions of love and care, meant to instill in the child a sense of appreciation and responsibility. To receive such a gift was to understand the value of labor and love. It was a lesson in gratitude, a reminder that the most precious things in life were not bought from a store, but made with loving hands. The gift was not an improving toy in the middle-class sense, but it was an improving experience, teaching a child to value sentiment over substance, and to find joy in the simple, heartfelt gestures of family. Interestingly, the very modern-sounding fear of spoiling a child was already a significant concern for the Victorians. The popular magazines of the day were filled with stern warnings to parents, insisting that an overabundance of toys and sweets could lead to a host of moral failings. Too many gifts could make a child idle, vain, greedy, and dissatisfied with their station in life. A good gift was one that stirred gratitude, not avarice. To combat this perceived threat, some families even practiced a form of gift moderation, a concept that sounds as joyfully festive as a tax audit. They would deliberately give fewer but more meaningful presents in order to teach their children the virtues of restraint and thoughtful reflection. One can only imagine the thrill of a child on Christmas morning, being presented with a single, improving book and a lecture on the importance of not wanting anything else. So, while a Victorian child might wait to the delight of finding a stocking filled with nuts, a wooden puzzle, or a second-hand book, the real gift, the one that truly mattered to their parents, was less visible. It was the quiet, relentless reinforcement of the values they held dear: obedience, thrift, reverence, duty, and a healthy suspicion of excessive fun. It was a complete moral education, delivered with a sprig of holly and a witty rhyme. In the Victorian nursery, joy and discipline were inseparable partners, waltzing together in a strange, slightly unnerving dance. Even under the festive glitter of tinsel and the warm glow of candlelight, you could be sure that Santa, in his Victorian incarnation, was less a jolly bringer of toys and more a stern but benevolent schoolmaster, checking his list not just for who was naughty or nice, but for who had demonstrated the most significant moral improvement over the past year. Walk down a modern high street in December, and you are immediately engulfed in a full sensory assault of festive cheer. A consumerist juggernaut powered by Mariah Carey and gingerbread-flavored everything. It's hard to imagine a time when shop windows weren't glowing with twinkling lights, When holiday jingles didn't hum from every corner, or when the entire season wasn't a frantic, glitter-dusted countdown to a morning of frenzied unwrapping. But this glittering, slightly hysterical version of Christmas, with its Black Friday stampedes and its 12-month-long retail cycle, had to start somewhere. Its roots, tangled and deep, are planted firmly in the 19th century, specifically in the Victorian era, when the holiday began its slow, inexorable transformation from a quiet, family-centered, and often deeply religious observance into a full-blown retail phenomenon. Before the reign of Queen Victoria, a Christmas gift was often a modest and deeply personal affair. It might be a hand-knitted scarf, a carefully preserved jar of jam, a book passed down through the family, or a small, carved wooden toy. Gifts were tokens of affection, exchanged primarily between family members, their value measured in sentiment and effort, not in shillings and pence. But by the mid-1800s, a perfect storm of cultural change, industrial muscle, and breathtakingly clever marketing began to reshape the season into something we would find unnervingly familiar. Suddenly, the Christmas spirit had a price tag, a beautifully lettered, beribboned price tag, and people were lining up, purses in hand, eager to pay it. At the very heart of this seismic shift was the rise of a magnificent new beast, the department store. These were not mere shops. They were grand, multi-storied temples of consumption, cathedrals of commerce dedicated to the worship of the material good. Palaces like London's Whiteleys, the opulent Harrods, and later, the up-and-coming Selfridges offered the public something utterly new and intoxicating, a curated Christmas experience. For the first time, a shopper didn't have to trudge from the butcher to the baker to the candlestick maker. They could step out of the grimy, horse-drawn chaos of the street and into a wonderland of polished mahogany and gleaming glass, where everything one could possibly desire was gathered under one roof. Entire sections of these grand stores were dedicated to holiday goods. There were tables piled high with German-made toys, counters shimmering with perfume bottles and silver trinkets, and shelves groaning with beautifully bound books and fashionable novelties, all conveniently arranged for the sole purpose of being given as a gift. Shopping, once a chore, was reborn as a festive outing, a dazzling spectacle for the whole family. The retailers, being the astute students of human nature that they are, quickly learned that they weren't just selling objects. They were selling feelings. They began to tap into the powerful, sentimental side of the holiday with a skill that would make a modern marketing executive weep with admiration. Advertisements, now a regular feature in the burgeoning newspapers and magazines, didn't just list products and prices. They sold a fantasy. They promised joy, wonder, domestic harmony, and the delighted faces of children, if only you purchased the right gift from the right store. Full-color illustrations in children's publications depicted bustling, magical shops filled with jolly, smiling clerks, subtly forging an unbreakable link in the young mind between Christmas cheer and commercial exchange. The message was clear. Happiness could be bought, wrapped, and placed under a tree. Even Santa Claus, that ancient, beloved symbol of the season, got a corporate makeover. The figure of Father Christmas or Saint Nicholas had long been a part of folklore, but he was a shadowy, inconsistent character, sometimes depicted as a lean, stern bishop, other times as a rowdy, pagan spirit of winter feasting. It was the Victorian commercial machine that took this nebulous figure and transformed him into the standardized, red-robed, white-bearded, and reliably cheerful gift-giver we recognize today. Illustrated advertisements, most famously by cartoonist Thomas Nast in America, solidified his image. Department stores then brought this image to life, hiring actors to sit in elaborate in-store grottos, where children could come and whisper their desires directly into the ear of the man himself, a brilliant marketing stroke that turned a child's wish list into a direct-to-consumer shopping list for their parents. Santa, the magical being, had become Santa, the ultimate brand ambassador. This retail revolution was fueled by the roar of the steam engine and the efficiency of the newly organized postal system. The explosive growth of the railways meant that goods manufactured in London or Manchester could be transported quickly and cheaply to the furthest corners of the country. A toy that was the height of fashion in the capital could now appear in a shop window in a small provincial town just days later. The introduction of reliable, affordable mail delivery, like the penny post, unleashed another commercial torrent, the mail-order catalog. Companies like the Great Exhibition's famed Crystal Palace Emporium began to offer mail-order services, publishing thick catalogs filled with illustrations of every conceivable product. Now, even those who lived miles from the nearest grand department store could participate in the festive shopping frenzy. This nationalized the Christmas market, creating a shared appetite for the same mass-produced goods, all wrapped up in a new, exciting Christmas flair. Of course, not everyone was thrilled by this new wave of holiday commerce. A chorus of concerned clergymen and social commentators began to raise their voices in protest, worrying that the true, spiritual meaning of Christmas was being lost, drowned in a sea of tinsel, trinkets, and transactional cheer. They wrote stern editorials and preached fiery sermons, urging their flocks to turn away from the false idols of the marketplace and return to the true meaning of the season: charity, quiet reflection, and religious reverence. They saw the holiday being hijacked, transformed from a holy day into a shopkeeper's festival. But their well-intentioned warnings were, for the most part, drowned out by the cheerful, relentless jingle of cash registers and the satisfying rustle of wrapping paper. The commercial tide was too strong, too glittering, too much fun. And yet, it would be too cynical to say that the Victorian Christmas became entirely hollow. Even as the holiday grew more commercial, the deep fundamental desire to connect, to give, to delight, and to show affection remained at its core. The Victorians may have invented the Christmas rush, with all its attendant stress and expense, but they also believed deeply and sincerely in the joy of giving. That joy was now simply expressed through a new language, a language of purchased goods as well as handmade treasures. The love behind a gift was still paramount, whether it came in the form of a hand-stitched apron made over long, candlelit evenings, or a carefully selected, store-bought trinket that the giver knew would bring a smile to the recipient's face. By the end of the 19th century, the transformation was complete. Christmas was no longer just a day. It was a season, a cultural and economic powerhouse. And for better or for worse, the stores had taken center stage. The spirit of the holiday, that elusive, magical feeling of warmth and generosity, now lived in two places at once. It could still be found by the family fireside, in the quiet moments of togetherness and reflection, but it was also shining brightly, irresistibly, from behind every frosted shop window. In the tightly laced, emotionally constipated world of Victorian England, a gift was rarely just an object. To hand someone a present was to engage in a silent, subtle, and sometimes deeply personal conversation. At a time when open emotional expression was frowned upon with the same vigor as wearing the wrong fork for fish. The art of sentimental gifting became a kind of secret language, a Morse code of the heart tapped out in flowers, ribbons, and carefully chosen trinkets. This was not just about giving something pretty. It was about embedding that prettiness with layers of meaning so thick you could slice them. Carefully chosen items, paired with a snippet of poetry, a specific symbol, or a coded message, allowed people to express raging torrents of affection, longing, sorrow, or admiration without ever having to say a word aloud and risk frightening the horses. This culture of meaning was not a niche hobby. It was everywhere, an invisible ink that coded every social interaction. A lady receiving a handkerchief embroidered with violets wasn't just getting a fancy nose wiper. She was receiving a declaration of faithfulness. A gentleman being gifted a sprig of ivy was being told his friendship was evergreen and steadfast. A locket, that quintessential Victorian token, was a miniature vault for the most intimate of relics. A curl of a baby's hair, a pressed flower from a shared walk, a tiny, folded-up portrait of a loved one. The very material of a gift was a message in itself. Ivory was for purity, pearls for innocence, turquoise for good fortune, and jet, the glossy black stone, was the universally recognized uniform of mourning. Victorians were absolute masters of this symbolic vocabulary, and they expected their recipients to be fluent. To receive a gift was to be handed a puzzle, and you were expected to understand the references, or at least have the good grace to pretend you did, nodding thoughtfully as if you, too, were well versed in the emotional significance of a particular type of fern. One of the most popular and potent sentimental gifts, a veritable emotional atom bomb, was the memory book or scrapbook. These were often compiled by young women with far too much time on their hands and a universe of unexpressed feelings bubbling just beneath their demure exteriors. A memory book was not a casual photo album. It was a carefully curated museum of the soul. Its pages were filled with a layered collage of sentiment, pressed flowers from a meaningful bouquet, snippets of lace from a special dress, copied-out poems that spoke of unrequited love or eternal friendship, delicate watercolor sketches of a favorite landscape, and personal mottos written in an elegant, looping script. Each page was a confession. A pressed pansy might mean thinking of you, while a sprig of rosemary was for remembrance. The order of the pages, the choice of the verses, the very style of the calligraphy, it was all part of a deeply personal narrative. To give someone such a book, especially a potential suitor, wasn't a casual act. It was an act of profound intimacy, something closer to handing over your personal diary and a key to your innermost thoughts than simply giving a Christmas present. It was the Victorian equivalent of giving someone the password to your phone. Even the most mundane, everyday items could be transformed into vessels of coded meaning when exchanged at Christmas. The possibilities for misreading were intentionally bending. These codes added a thrilling, dangerous for song to the entire exchange. A single glove, given by a gentleman to a lady, could be interpreted as a silent, desperate plea. I wish to hold your hand. A lady, in turn, might use her fan not just to cool herself, but to communicate across a crowded, chaperoned room. A fan snapped shut meant, I wish to speak with you, while slowly fanning it meant, I am married. A useful, if sometimes disappointing, piece of information. A lady giving a gentleman a handkerchief she had embroidered herself was a clear signal of polite affection and favor. For him to receive a pair of hand-embroidered slippers from her, however, was a shocking leap into domesticity. a hint at a shared, cozy future by the fire that could either delight him or send him running for the nearest exit. It was a game of emotional poker, played with accessories, where a misplaced bookmark could be interpreted as a declaration of undying love, and a simple ribbon could be seen as a promise. Poetry, that great refuge of the emotionally articulate but verbally restrained, played a starring role in this sentimental theater. It was rare for a gift of any significance to be given without an accompanying verse, either handwritten on a beautiful card, tucked inside the pages of a book, or, for the truly dedicated, painstakingly stitched onto a sampler. These poems were often drawn from the popular sentimental poets of the day: Tennyson, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Longfellow, or, for the brave and romantically inclined, composed by the giver themselves. The language was almost always flowery, overwrought, and dripping with a level of emotion that would make a modern person deeply uncomfortable. It was a festival of these and thous, of hearts compared to fragile flowers and souls likened to tempest-tossed ships. It was, to be frank, often excruciatingly cloying. But this elaborate, high-flown language served a crucial purpose. It provided a safe, socially sanctioned container for feelings that were simply too big, too messy, too intense for polite Victorian conversation. On paper, shielded by the conventions of rhyme and meter, people were allowed to feel more freely, to express a passion and a depth of feeling that would have caused a scandal if spoken aloud over tea. But this delicate, coded language wasn't just about the giddy heights of romance. It was also a vital tool for navigating the depths of grief. Mourning gifts were a key and poignant part of Victorian sentimentality, a way of making loss tangible and shared. In an age when death was a frequent and very public visitor, these gifts were not seen as morbid, but as tender, necessary acknowledgments of a shared sorrow. A simple black ribbon, worn on a dress or tied around a wrist, was a public signal of bereavement. A photograph of the deceased, placed in an ornate memorial frame, often made of jet or dark wood, was a way to keep their image present and honored in the home. Perhaps the most iconic mourning gift was the hair brooch. A lock of a loved one's hair would be intricately woven into a pattern, a flower, a weeping willow, a geometric design, and encased behind glass in a brooch or a locket. It was a way of keeping a physical part of the person you had lost close to your heart, a deeply intimate and comforting memento. These gifts were a way of saying, "I remember them. I share your pain." They were a testament to the enduring power of love in the face of loss, a way to keep loved ones present in a world that was all too familiar with absence. To our modern eyes, accustomed as we are to a culture of direct, if sometimes brutal, emotional honesty, these coded exchanges might seem elaborate, overly precious, or even a little silly. We send a text message to say, "I love you." They sent a bouquet of red tulips to declare their love. We post a tribute on social media to remember the dead. They wore their hair. But for the Victorians, sentimental gifting was a form of emotional fluency, a vital and sophisticated skill for navigating the complex currents of love, grief, friendship, and hope within the rigid confines of social decorum. It was a language that allowed for nuance, for subtlety, for a depth of feeling that their spoken words often had to conceal. Every trinket had a voice. Every gesture cast a shadow of meaning. And when words failed, or, more accurately, when words were simply not permitted, a gift could, and did, speak volumes for the heart. If the Victorian Christmas now seems to us like a grand, glittering, and slightly overwhelming spectacle, a festive behemoth built of ornaments, sentiment, ritual, and a frankly alarming number of rules, you can lay a significant portion of the blame, or the credit, at the feet of one small, formidable woman, Queen Victoria herself. More than any monarch before her, and arguably any since, she helped shape the modern holiday, personally presiding over its transformation from a quiet, often rowdy, and largely religious observance into the cultural tradition we recognize today, filled with gifts, decorations, and a heavy emphasis on domestic warmth. And like so much of Victorian life, the royal family didn't just reflect the values of their society. They were the trendsetters, the ultimate influencers of their age. When Queen Victoria gave a gift, or decorated a tree, or did pretty much anything festive, the nation took notice, took notes, and then frantically tried to copy it. The Great Christmas Transformation began early in her reign, but the true catalyst was not the Queen herself, but her German-born consort, the serious, intelligent, and perpetually misunderstood Prince Albert. Albert, bless his sensible German heart, arrived in the damp and drafty castles of England, carrying with him the cherished traditions of his homeland, chief among them the magical custom of the Christmas tree. In England at the time, a bit of holly and ivy was about as festive as decorations got. The idea of dragging an entire fir tree into the drawing room and setting it ablaze with candles was seen as a charming, if slightly insane, German eccentricity. But Albert persisted. And then, in 1848, something happened that would change the British Christmas forever. An illustration, a simple woodcut engraving, was published in the wildly popular Illustrated London News. It depicted the royal family, Victoria, Albert, and their brood of children, gathered around a beautifully decorated tabletop tree at Windsor Castle. This single image was revolutionary. It was an earthquake in ink. For centuries, royalty had been depicted as remote, godlike figures, draped in ermine and staring sternly into the middle distance. This picture, however, was different. It was warm, it was domestic, it was deeply, shockingly human. Here was the most powerful woman in the world, not on a throne, but in a comfortable dress, surrounded by her children, her face softened by the gentle twinkling light of the candles on the tree. Here was a family, looking happy, normal, and utterly captivated by the magic of the season. The image went viral in the slow, deliberate way things did in the 19th century. It was reprinted, copied, and discussed in drawing rooms and parlors across the nation. And its effect was immediate and profound. The Christmas tree, once a foreign novelty, became an overnight sensation, a must-have accessory for any respectable, fashion-conscious family in England. And what, pray tell, goes under a Christmas tree? Gifts, of course. That single cozy illustration did more than just sell trees. It supercharged the practice of gift-giving. Before, gifts were exchanged, certainly, but now they had a stage, a festive centerpiece around which the entire ritual could be performed. The Queen had, with the help of her German prince and a clever magazine illustrator, made Christmas fashionable. And fashion demanded presents. The act of giving a gift was no longer just a private exchange of affection between family members. It had become a social expectation, a key part of the performance of a proper, modern, and royally approved Christmas. Queen Victoria herself was a prolific and enthusiastic giver, a woman who seemed to revel in the selection and presentation of gifts. Her approach was a fascinating blend of the deeply personal and the highly strategic. For her family, particularly Albert and their children, She had a great fondness for handmade and sentimental items. She was an accomplished artist herself and would often give her own watercolor paintings or sketches. She delighted in embroidered cushions, personalized trinkets, and sentimental keepsakes that spoke of shared memories and private jokes. This was Victoria, the wife and mother, expressing genuine affection through thoughtful, personal tokens. But there was another side to her gifting. Victoria the Queen. To her ministers, to foreign dignitaries, and to the vast staff of the royal household, she gave gifts that were symbols of royal appreciation, strategic favor, or benevolent power. These were finely crafted goods, exquisite porcelain from the royal potteries, gleaming silver, beautifully bound books, and works of art. Each gift was carefully chosen, its value and nature calibrated to the recipient's rank and service. A gift from the Queen was not just a present. It was a message, a tangible piece of royal favor that could elevate a career or cement an alliance. This dual approach, both sentimental and strategic, set the tone for the entire country. Among the upper and aspiring middle classes, who looked to the monarchy for their social cues, gifting became not just an act of generosity, but a complex performance of taste, status, and intent. You didn't just give a present. You made a statement. And if you could casually mention that your particular style of gift wrapping was in the manner of the Queen, or that the book you chosen was a favorite of His Royal Highness, the Prince Consort, so much the better. The Royal Christmas became the gold standard against which all other Christmases were measured. The Queen's own children were, of course, brought up in this rich tradition of festive exchange. The royal archives are filled with records of the elaborate and thoughtful gifts they gave to each other and to their parents. There were hand-painted cards, intricate musical boxes, custom-made clothing, and carefully selected books. The gifts were often wrapped with immense care, adorned with lace, ribbons, and sprigs of holly, and presented with a great sense of ceremony on Christmas Eve, following the German custom. This further solidified the image of the royal family as the perfect model of domestic, gift-giving bliss, a model that thousands of families across the nation eagerly sought to emulate. Perhaps what made Victoria's influence so powerful and so enduring was that she managed to make Christmas feel both royal and relatable at the same time. Her public image, carefully cultivated throughout her long reign, emphasized family, tradition, and sentiment values that resonated deeply with a nation grappling with the immense social upheaval of the Industrial Revolution. In an age of rapid change, of shifting social structures and growing cities, the idea of a stable, loving, and deeply traditional royal family was not just charming. It was profoundly comforting. They were the nation's family, and their Christmas was the nation's Christmas. So when Victorians gathered around their newly fashionable Christmas trees, lit their candles, and exchanged their carefully chosen gifts by the firelight, they weren't just celebrating a holiday. They were, in a very real way, imitating their queen. They were participating in a shared cultural ritual that she had championed and popularized. Queen Victoria, with her quiet but powerful touch, had taken the raw materials of an old religious festival and, with a little help from her German husband, had given her people permission to turn it into something more magical, more meaningful, more domestic, and ultimately, more modern than it had ever been before. She gave them the Christmas we still, in many ways, celebrate today. Beneath all the starched collars, the rigid etiquette, the carefully measured gestures, and the sheer, exhausting performance of being a respectable 19th century human, There was something very real beating at the heart of the Victorian Christmas. Feeling. Raw, often unspoken, deeply layered, and occasionally volcanic emotion. The Victorians may have been the undisputed world champions of formality, the black belts of the stiff upper lip, but the annual ritual of gift-giving gave them a rare and powerful outlet, a socially sanctioned loophole through which they could pour all the things their buttoned-up world would not allow them to say. It was a secret language, a way to connect across the vast, silent chasms of propriety, a method to express love, regret, pride, sorrow, and hope. Behind every perfectly tied bow, behind every sheet of carefully chosen paper, there was something pulsing quietly, the heart. To truly understand this, you have to imagine the emotional climate of the era, which was roughly equivalent to a beautifully furnished, well-dusted, but hermetically sealed room. Expressing affection openly, especially in public or outside the hallowed, legally binding institution of marriage, was often frowned upon with a severity usually reserved for treason or serving fish without the proper fork. A man was expected to be a pillar of stoic reserve, a woman a paragon of demure composure. Warmth was something to be confined to the private pages of a diary, to be hidden in the ink of a secret letter, or perhaps to be glimpsed in the occasional, scandalous flush of a cheek at a Christmas gathering. But a gift? A gift was different. A gift was a Trojan horse, capable of smuggling a whole army of feelings past the guards of social convention. A gift was allowed to speak. For parents, particularly the stern Victorian patriarch, who spent his days being a formidable titan of industry, and his evenings being a formidable titan of silent newspaper reading, a Christmas gift could be a quiet, fumbling apology. It could be a gesture meant to make up for long hours at the office, for a temper lost in haste, or for the emotional distance that the era demanded of him. The magnificent, expensive rocking horse that appeared by the fire on Christmas morning was not just a toy. It was a clumsy wooden attempt to say, "I love you," even if I only ever address you as boy and communicate primarily through grunts. For a mother, bound by the endless, invisible threads of domestic management, a gift could be a tangible expression of a pride she felt but could not always show. The carefully chosen book, the beautiful new dress, these were ways of saying, "I see you. I am proud of the person you are becoming." And for the children, a gift given to a parent was often a shy, hopeful plea for approval. The lopsided, hand-stitched pen wiper, the slightly smudged watercolor of a flower, these were not just crafts. They were offerings, shyly presented in the desperate hope of earning a rare, treasured smile or a quiet word of praise. Nowhere was this secret language more potent, more thrilling, or more dangerous than in the realm of courtship. For two young people navigating the romantic minefield of chaperones, formal calls, and unspoken rules, a gift was a vital channel of communication. It could carry volumes of meaning that could never be spoken aloud. A small, simple sketch of a shared landscape, tucked into a book, was a way of saying, "I remember that day with you. It mattered to me." A single pressed flower, chosen for its specific symbolic meaning, a violet for faithfulness, a rose for love, was a confession in botanical form. A poem, copied out by hand and slipped between the pages of a seemingly innocent book of sermons, could be a declaration of such passionate longing that it would make the recipient's head spin. These were tokens so minor in physical size, yet so overflowing with emotional weight, they could change the entire course of a relationship. And for friends, separated by the rigid class divides or the simple, vast distances of 19th century travel, a thoughtful parcel sent by post was often the only way to bridge the silence. The arrival of a box containing a hand-knitted shawl, a jar of familiar jam, or a book by a shared favorite author was a powerful, tangible message. You are gone from my sight, but you are not gone from my heart. I still think of you. But the emotional landscape of the Victorian gift was not all romance and friendship. There was also a quiet, pervasive sadness that crept into many of the objects they exchanged, a melancholy born of grim reality. In an era of high mortality, where disease could sweep away a child, a spouse, or a sibling with terrifying speed and randomness, the things people gave each other often became anchors to memory, ways of holding on in a world that was constantly threatening to take things away. A locket was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a reliquary containing a precious lock of a lost child's hair. A pair of gloves, still faintly scented with the perfume of a departed wife, was not just an accessory. It was a ghost, a tangible piece of her presence. A photograph, framed in black jet and with a date handwritten on the back, was not just a picture. It was an act of defiance against the finality of death. These were not just gifts. They were acts of remembrance, ways of keeping loved ones close in a time when absence was a constant, aching presence in so many homes. Even among casual acquaintances, within the strict and seemingly impersonal bounds of neighborhood etiquette, gifts carried these quiet emotional undercurrents. A neighbor might bring over a jar of jam, not just because it was a polite and practical gesture, but because she remembered a passing comment you'd made months ago about your fondness for blackberries. The gift, then, was not the jam itself, but the act of being remembered, of being listened to. A schoolteacher might hand a promising but poor student a second-hand book, not only as a tool to encourage learning, but as a silent acknowledgement of their potential, a quiet message that said, "I see something special in you." These were small, flickering candles of human connection, lit in the formal, often chilly, drawing rooms of Victorian life. They were modest packages, wrapped in simple paper, yet their warmth lingered long after the holiday had passed. The great irony of it all is that the very rules designed to restrain and suppress emotion sometimes had the opposite effect. They made it burn brighter, hotter, and with more intensity in the few outlets it was allowed. The more society asked Victorians to contain their feelings, to maintain a placid and respectable surface, the more meaning, passion, and significance they poured into the secret channels of communication they had developed. The gift became a pressure valve, a place where a year's worth of unspoken love, unexpressed grief, or unacknowledged pride could finally be released in a carefully chosen, beautifully presented object. It was one of the few moments in the year when sentiment was not only allowed, it was expected, encouraged, and celebrated. And so, behind the polished silver, the intricate embroidery, the carefully tied ribbons, and the formal, scripted thank you notes lay the simple, beating truth of it all. Victorian gift-giving was never just about what was exchanged. It was about what was revealed. It was about the feelings too delicate for direct words, the bonds too complex for polite conversation, and the hopes, fears, and affections too quiet to say aloud. It was a language for the heart, spoken in stitches and ink and paper and lace, in polished wood and pressed flowers, a silent, eloquent testament to the enduring human need to connect, to remember, and to love, even in the most buttoned up of times.